to be vulnerable is to be vulnerable. You can be hurt, and we don't like being vulnerable, and we especially don't like being vulnerable around people we don't trust. And if you've come into a place where, and these are cultural issues, where you are in conflict with other leaders around you and you're not trusting each other, the idea of vulnerability is emotionally terrifying.
Yeah.
And I actually also want to include in the idea of holistic leadership, that's something holistic leaders are able to do. And that's because they can navigate up to that cultural layer.
Yeah.
And if you can't, if you're not willing to be vulnerable, and then you're not going to get where you want to go in those relationships. And that's not going to create the right incentives that drive the behaviors, that create your culture, that enable the products that will, in more ways than you realize, drive the process you have and allow you to succeed or fail as an organization. And Brene Brown speaks a lot about vulnerability. She's quite an expert on it. But there's an idea that we have that to be vulnerable is to be perceived as weak. And the irony, it's paradoxical, because that feels true. Oh, if someone is vulnerable, that means they are weak. And again, they're the hippie or whatever. They're, spouting their emotional crap. We don't need that at work. But when we actually see people being vulnerable, we tend to respect them more rather than less. And it's like we've tricked ourselves into believing we should never be vulnerable because that'll get us hurt and everybody will think we're stupid or weak or bad or whatever. But when we actually see someone stand up in front of a large group of people and be vulnerable, we're often like, oh, wow. Sometimes I think it makes us uncomfortable because we're like, that's a lot of vulnerability you're expressing. And obviously there's inappropriate ways to do that. But generally we look at someone who's doing that, we're like, wow, I have a lot of respect for that person because there's bravery in the vulnerability. And that speaks to the idea. And I think there is a core idea around holistic leadership, which is courage.
Yeah.
Courage is required.